a flight from New York to Los Angeles. Zara, a young woman with a first-class ticket, is ready for a peaceful journey. But when a flight attendant denies her access to the cabin, insisting she's in the wrong place, Zara's calm demeanor is tested like never before. What the flight attendant doesn't know is that Zara's father owns the very airline they're flying with. What happens next will leave you questioning how far some will go to judge others, and what happens when the truth is finally revealed. Before we get started, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing stories. Zara stood at the entrance of the first-class cabin, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. It was her first flight home in 2 years, and this wasn't just any flight. It marked the end of her studies, the beginning of a new chapter, and a chance to reconnect with her family. She had been granted the privilege of flying first class, a perk that felt strange yet deserved after everything she had accomplished. With a soft smile, she glanced at her boarding pass again. It read, "First Class," confirming her rightful place on this flight. Zara wasn't one to show off or flaunt her accomplishments. In fact, she had always preferred to keep a low profile, especially when it came to her father, Victor Bennett, the very man who owned the airline. He was humble, treating everyone with kindness, from the cleaning staff to the board executives. Zara admired him for that. She, too, had grown up with a sense of quiet confidence, but today was different. Today she was about to board this flight with the confidence of knowing that everything she had achieved was hers, no one else's, and she was deserving of this moment. As she made her way toward the gate, her eyes scanned the luxurious first-class lounge. The plush leather chairs, the soft jazz music, and the gentle murmur of passengers added to the sense of calm around her. Zara found a seat in one of the chairs by the window, her thoughts drifting momentarily as she checked her phone. A text from her father popped up. "Let me know when you're settled. Can't wait to see you." Zara smiled and typed back, "Almost there. I'll text you once I'm on the plane." It had been a long time since she had seen her father, and this trip was more than just a flight. It was a reunion, a moment to reflect on all that had happened since they last saw each other. Zara had spent years away from home, focusing on her studies, and now, as she prepared to return home, she felt a sense of pride in what she had achieved. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. As the boarding announcement rang out, Zara stood and grabbed her carry-on bag, ready to make her way to the gate. She joined the first-class line, her excitement tempered by the thought of being reunited with her father. However, as she approached the door, she noticed something. One of the flight attendants, a woman with sharp features and a tight bun, was watching her closely. The flight attendant, Claudia, glanced over at her colleague, then back at Zara. Zara felt the weight of her gaze, but didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the usual check-in routine. What happened next, though, would change everything. Claudia scanned Zara's boarding pass with a practiced smile, but as she glanced down at it, her expression faltered just for a moment. "Welcome aboard," Claudia said politely, but there was something about her tone that didn't feel right. Zara smiled back, ready to move forward, but Claudia's hand shot out to stop her. "I'm sorry, young lady," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "First class is for paying passengers only. You'll need to go to economy." Zara blinked, taken aback. She held out her ticket, her voice steady but confused. "I'm a first-class passenger. This is my seat." Claudia's eyes narrowed as she glanced at the ticket Zara held out, her posture suddenly more rigid. "There must be some mistake," Claudia said, her tone now colder, almost dismissive. "Please head to economy, young lady." "We can't have delays." Zara, still standing there, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped her boarding pass, felt the sting of the flight attendant's words. The other passengers who had started to board were now watching the exchange, some with curious glances, others with looks of confusion. The tension in the air was palpable. Zara's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her composure. "This is my seat," she repeated softly but firmly. "There's no mistake." Her voice was calm, but a flicker of frustration bubbled under the surface. She had never experienced anything like this before. She had been given this seat because she had earned it, and the ticket was in her hand to prove it. She wasn't about to back down. Claudia's eyes shifted from the ticket to Zara's face, scanning her as though trying to gauge whether she was telling the truth. But instead of directing Zara to her seat as she should have, Claudia's lips curled into a tight smile. "Look, I really don't want to cause any trouble," Claudia said, her voice dropping slightly. "Just head to economy and we'll take care of it later." The passengers behind Zara were starting to shift uncomfortably. Some were whispering to each other, others were beginning to grow impatient, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Zara felt the weight of their eyes on her, each glance a silent reminder that she was being judged, not for who she was, but for the assumptions others had made about her. It was as if she didn't belong here, simply because of the way she looked, but Zara didn't let that stop her. She took a deep breath, her back straightening, and spoke again, this time with even more certainty. "This is my seat, and I'm going to sit in it." She looked at Claudia not with anger, but with a quiet determination. Claudia's smile faltered, and for a split second, Zara thought she saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But Claudia quickly recovered, her tone now even more dismissive. "I don't want to make a scene," she said, her voice growing sharper. "If you don't comply, I'll have to call security." The words hit Zara like a slap. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. But then she straightened her shoulders and walked past Claudia, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't going to let anyone make her feel less than she was. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Carry yourself with dignity, no matter what others think." Zara took a step forward, moving toward her seat in first class, but Claudia wasn't done yet. As Zara made her way toward her assigned seat, the murmurs of the passengers around her grew louder. She could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others judgmental. It was as if she were walking in slow motion, the weight of every glance pressing down on her shoulders. She kept her head held high, refusing to let the tension and humiliation show on her face. Despite the growing discomfort, she moved forward, clutching her carry-on bag tightly. The aisle stretched out before her, and every step felt like an eternity. She reached her row, a window seat in first class, and sat down, placing her bag in the overhead compartment. But the discomfort didn't end once she sat down. No, it only escalated. A few moments later, Claudia appeared in the aisle again, this time with a purposeful stride. Zara watched her approach, the coldness in her expression unmistakable. Claudia stopped in front of Zara's row, her eyes scanning the cabin before settling back on Zara. "Excuse me, young lady," Claudia said, her voice now firm, her tone authoritative. "First class is reserved for paying passengers only. I need to see your ticket." Zara blinked, her confusion turning to frustration. She had already shown Claudia the ticket. Why was this happening again? She pulled the boarding pass from her bag and extended it to Claudia, her hand slightly shaking, but her voice steady. "Here's my ticket," Zara said, her patience thinning. "I am a first-class passenger." Claudia didn't immediately take the ticket. Instead, she crossed her arms and eyed Zara with a look of skepticism, as if she was sure there was some mistake. "I don't think so," Claudia replied dismissively. "You need to move along. First class isn't for people like you." Her words, though veiled in a tone of professionalism, were sharp and dismissive. The insult was clear, and it sent a wave of disbelief through Zara. She had been taught to stand her ground, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her seat. It was about something deeper. It was about the assumptions Claudia had made because of the way Zara looked. Zara's grip tightened on her boarding pass, but she kept her composure. "This is my seat. There's no mistake. My father bought this for me. The words left her mouth before she could stop them, a part of her hoping that they would put an end to this madness. Claudia's eyes flickered, but her expression didn't soften. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, her voice dripping with doubt. "Your father?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "And where is he now?" Zara felt a flush of anger rise to her cheeks, but she held her ground. "He's waiting for me at our destination," she replied calmly, "and I would appreciate it if you would stop questioning me and let me sit in my seat." Claudia scoffed, glancing around as if searching for validation from the other passengers. Zara could feel the eyes of the people around her boring into her, some of them exchanging uncomfortable glances, others unsure of how to react. The tension in the cabin was rising, and Zara could hear the soft mutterings of passengers who were clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding situation. Still, no one spoke up. They were all witnesses, but no one was stepping forward to challenge what was happening. Claudia's eyes flicked back to the ticket, then back to Zara's face. "I'm going to need to verify this," she said curtly. "Wait here." Zara sat frozen in her seat, the sting of humiliation tightening in her chest. She glanced around, hoping someone would speak up, but the whispers only grew louder. Passengers in economy were starting to take notice of the scene. No one intervened. No one stood up for her. Zara could feel the knot of frustration tightening in her chest, but she refused to let the tears rise. "I am not going to let them see me break," she thought to herself, her father's words still ringing in her mind. She had to be strong. She had to be composed. As Claudia walked away to verify the ticket, Zara closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She wasn't just fighting for a seat on a plane anymore. She was fighting for her dignity, for the respect that everyone deserved, no matter their race, background, or appearance. She just hoped that someone would see that too. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Zara sat still, her back straight, her eyes trained ahead, though her mind was racing. Claudia hadn't returned, and the weight of the silence around her seemed to grow with every second. The cabin hum, once a soothing background noise, now felt oppressive, as if it too was aware of the injustice happening in front of it. Passengers continued to stare, some in pity, others in judgment. Zara could hear snippets of whispered conversations from the rows behind her, but no one dared to speak directly to her, not even those who seemed to sympathize. The feeling of isolation began to creep in. She was alone in this fight, and the reality of it stung deeper than she expected. As Zara sat there, the minutes stretching on, her thoughts turned inward. Why was this happening, she wondered. She had done nothing wrong. She had followed the rules, presented her boarding pass, and had a legitimate ticket for the seat she was in. Yet here she was being questioned, humiliated in front of strangers, all because of the assumptions made about her. Her skin, her appearance, her very presence in first class, it was as though she didn't belong there in the eyes of Claudia. Why couldn't they see me for who I am? The thought echoed painfully in her mind, but she quickly shook it off. She wasn't going to let their ignorance define her. I belong here. I've earned this. I won't let them take that from me. Just as she began to regain her focus, Claudia returned, walking down the aisle with a brisk, almost exaggerated pace. Zara's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw something shift in Claudia's expression. It wasn't the dismissive coldness that had marked their earlier exchanges. No, this time there was a flicker of something else, uncertainty, perhaps even guilt. Claudia stopped at Zara's row, her hand trembling ever so slightly, as she looked at the boarding pass in Zara's hand once more. I've checked, and there's no mistake," Claudia said, her voice quieter now, lacking the earlier firmness. "It seems your seat is indeed in first class." The words, though seemingly an apology, were coated with an edge of reluctance. Claudia's gaze flicked to the other passengers in the cabin as if seeking reassurance or validation. It was clear now that the flight attendant had realized her mistake, but it was just as evident that she wasn't ready to admit it fully. Zara kept her composure, resisting the urge to let the satisfaction of being right flood her, but the sense of vindication was growing. "I told you," Zara said, her voice calm but firm. "This is my seat. There's no mistake. I've paid for this ticket, and I'm not going anywhere." Claudia opened her mouth as if to respond, but then, seeing the calm determination in Zara's eyes, she hesitated. The tension between them hung in the air, thick and unyielding. A few moments passed before Claudia finally spoke, her words clipped and reluctant. "I'll just leave you to it," she muttered, before turning on her heel and walking away. Zara watched her retreating figure, her thoughts a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief because, at least for now, she had won this small battle. Frustration because she knew this wasn't the end. Claudia's prejudices hadn't been addressed, not yet. Zara couldn't help but wonder how many other people had been treated this way by Claudia simply because of who they were. How many had been too afraid or too beaten down to speak up? The thought gnawed at her. As the flight attendant disappeared into the galley, Zara allowed herself a moment to breathe, but she knew this wasn't over. Claudia had given Zara her seat, but the underlying issues hadn't gone away. This was just the beginning. What will happen when the truth comes out? Zara wondered. What will Claudia do then? The questions lingered in her mind as the flight continued to move forward, the quiet hum of the plane a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. Zara sat in her seat, her mind still racing as the plane ascended into the sky. She tried to distract herself by looking out the window, watching the clouds drift by below. But the peaceful view did little to calm the rising tension in her chest. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened, how a simple flight had turned into a battle for her dignity. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about something much deeper, something that wasn't just happening to her, but to so many others who had been unfairly judged because of their race, their background, or the way they looked. Zara could feel the weight of that reality pressing down on her, making her feel both small and powerful at the same time. She glanced around the cabin, watching the other passengers as they settled in. Some were already enjoying their meals, others reading or talking quietly among themselves. No one seemed to be looking her way anymore, but Zara knew they had all seen what had happened. She wondered what they were thinking. Did they see her as the troublemaker, the problem that Claudia had tried to paint her as? Or had they noticed the injustice, the way she had been treated without reason? Did anyone understand the pain she was feeling? It was then that she noticed a few quiet glances coming her way, small, sympathetic looks from a few passengers seated nearby. Zara could tell they were aware of what had occurred, but no one had spoken up. No one had come to her defense. It was as if they were all waiting for someone else to take the first step. For a brief moment, Zara felt a pang of loneliness. Why hadn't anyone intervened? Why hadn't anyone stood up for her when Claudia had tried to humiliate her? But then, just as quickly, she shook off the thought. She wasn't here to rely on the approval or help of strangers. She was here for herself, for her own strength, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away. Just as she was about to turn her attention back to the window, the flight attendant returned. But this time, it wasn't Claudia. It was a younger woman with a kind smile and a polite air about her. She walked down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks to passengers. When she reached Zara, she paused, noticing Zara's tense posture. The young flight attendant smiled gently, her voice soft. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee, tea, juice?" Zara blinked, momentarily taken off guard by the kindness in the woman's tone. It wasn't that Zara had expected rudeness, but after what had just happened, she had been bracing for more tension, more coldness. But this woman, her presence was different. She was warm, professional, and her genuine smile felt like a small but meaningful gesture of respect. Zara gave a small smile in return, her voice steady. "I'll have some water, please." The flight attendant nodded, making a quick note of Zara's request before moving on. Zara watched her walk away, the fleeting kindness leaving her with a small sense of comfort. At least not all the crew members had the same prejudices as Claudia, but still, something gnawed at Zara, the injustice of it all. Claudia's behavior had been unacceptable, and yet she was still walking freely, still carrying on as if nothing had happened. Zara's thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice from across the aisle. "I saw what happened earlier," an older woman said, her voice low but filled with sympathy. Zara turned to look at her, surprised. The woman's expression was filled with concern, and Zara noticed the small shake of her head as she continued. "That wasn't right, what she did to you. You didn't deserve to be treated like that." Zara blinked, unsure of how to respond. It had been a while since anyone had spoken to her like this, acknowledging the unfairness she had experienced. The woman's words, though simple, carried a weight of validation that Zara hadn't known she needed. For a brief moment she felt a flicker of hope, like maybe, just maybe, there were people out there who cared, who recognized the injustice when they saw it. "Thank you," Zara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means a lot to hear that." The older woman smiled warmly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're handling this with such grace," she said, her tone full of quiet admiration. "I don't think I could have done the same in your shoes." Zara offered a small smile in return, but her heart felt heavy. It wasn't just the flight attendant's behavior that was weighing on her, it was the fact that these kinds of situations still happened every day to so many people all over the world. Claudia's actions weren't an isolated incident. They were a reflection of the prejudices that ran deeper, ingrained in society. Zara couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't just let it go. She had to stand up for herself, not just for her own sake, but for the sake of everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed something more than just kind words from a stranger. She needed real change. And somehow, in the pit of her stomach, Zara knew that this moment on the plane, this fight for her dignity, was only the beginning. The bigger battle was yet to come. As the flight continued its journey through the sky, Zara's thoughts swirled around the events of the day. She had always prided herself on being patient and composed, but today had tested her in ways she hadn't expected. The sting of being questioned, treated as though she didn't belong, was still sharp. No matter how much she tried to focus on the future, on the excitement of returning home to see her father, the incident kept replaying in her mind. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the assumption that she wasn't worthy of it. The unfairness of it all made her blood boil, but she had kept her cool, just as her father had taught her. Zara couldn't help but wonder how many other passengers, especially those who looked like her, had experienced the same kind of treatment. How many people had been brushed aside because of their race or their appearance, dismissed by people in positions of power. Claudia had treated her as though her presence in first class was a mistake, a wrong that needed to be corrected. And that thought haunted her. But there was something else gnawing at Zara, something she couldn't shake. The way Claudia had spoken to her, the way she had dismissed her, made Zara realize how deeply ingrained the prejudice was. It wasn't just about her ticket, it was about her skin. Claudia hadn't even questioned the older white man who had boarded before Zara, or the woman with the designer purse, yet Zara had been stopped, scrutinized, and humiliated. Why was that? Zara wondered. She had the same right to be there as anyone else, and yet, because of the way she looked, she had been made to feel less than. It was a bitter realization that made the anger in her chest flare again. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden announcement over the intercom. The voice of the captain echoed through the cabin, smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are cruising at an altitude of 30,000 feet, and we will begin our descent shortly. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened and your seat backs and tray tables are in the upright position." Zara barely heard the rest of the announcement, her mind still wrapped in a cloud of frustration. She wanted this flight to be over, to step off the plane and leave behind the anger and humiliation she was feeling. But there was something deep inside her that told her the worst wasn't over. The way Claudia had acted, so confidently, so sure of herself, it wasn't the end of the story. Zara had a feeling that her journey wasn't just about getting home. There was something bigger at play here. As if on cue, Claudia appeared again, walking down the aisle with a tray of drinks in her hands. She moved past the first-class passengers without a glance, but as she neared Zara's row, something shifted. Her eyes met Zara's, and for a moment the coldness in her gaze faltered. It was only for a second, but Zara noticed it. Claudia's brief hesitation, the slight uncertainty in her step. Was it guilt? Was it doubt? Or was she simply trying to avoid eye contact after everything that had happened? Zara didn't know, but she wasn't about to let Claudia off easy. The flight attendant stopped in front of her seat, her smile forced and tight. "Would you like a drink, miss?" Claudia asked, her voice strained but polite, though it lacked the warmth of the other attendants. Zara looked at her, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "No, thank you," she said, her tone polite but firm. She didn't need anything from Claudia, not anymore. Claudia gave a small nod, her smile faltering slightly, but she didn't respond further. She walked away, her movements stiff, her gaze averted. Zara watched her retreat, wondering if she had made any impact at all. Claudia had clearly felt the tension. She had been forced to confront her own behavior, even if only for a moment. But Zara knew that was just the beginning. There were bigger consequences waiting, and Zara couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. Claudia had humiliated her, tried to strip her of her dignity, but there was one thing she hadn't realized. Zara was not going to let this slide. Not this time. The flight might be nearly over, but the real journey, the real reckoning, was just beginning. Zara wasn't about to let Claudia's actions go unchallenged, no matter what it took. The plane's engines hummed steadily, and the bright, clear skies outside seemed to offer a stark contrast to the growing tension inside the cabin. Zara leaned back in her seat, trying to steady her breathing, but the weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. She couldn't ignore the feeling of unease that settled in her chest. The injustice she'd faced wasn't just about a seat on a plane, it was about a deeper, more pervasive issue. Claudia had been wrong, but her behavior was only a reflection of a bigger problem, a problem that existed beyond this one flight, beyond this one encounter. It was everywhere. Zara's mind kept racing back to the moment she had been publicly humiliated, and every time she replayed it in her head, it stung a little more. What bothered her the most was how, in that moment, no one had stepped in to help. The other passengers had watched, some with sympathetic eyes, others with nothing but silence. No one had questioned Claudia. No one had stood up for Zara. It felt like a moment that should have been fought for, but it had passed, and she had to carry the weight of it alone. But as much as the pain of the experience stung, it also ignited something inside Zara, a determination to make things right, not just for herself, but for anyone who had been unfairly judged. This wasn't the kind of world she wanted to live in, where people like Claudia could wield their authority to tear others down based on nothing but their own biases. Zara wouldn't allow that to be the last word in her story. She would fight back quietly, without making a scene, but with a quiet strength that would make it impossible for anyone to ignore the wrong that had been done to her. As the flight neared its descent, a part of Zara knew that what had happened on the plane wouldn't just be forgotten. She had seen the looks of discomfort on some of the other passengers' faces when Claudia had confronted her. They knew something wasn't right. Zara wasn't alone in this after all. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and the flight attendants began preparing for landing. As Claudia passed by Zara's row again, Zara made sure to meet her gaze. There was a slight shift in Claudia's expression, a quick, almost imperceptible flash of regret, but it was gone before Zara could read it completely. Still, Zara's eyes remained steady, unflinching, as if silently acknowledging the tension in the room. It wasn't over, and she wasn't going to let it be. Claudia reached Zara's row, then hesitated. "Is there anything else I can get you?" she asked, her tone different now, more strained, less confident. Zara didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch for a few beats before speaking calmly, her voice firm and measured. "No, thank you," she said again, but this time the words carried a deeper weight. They weren't just a polite refusal, they were a declaration that she would not be silenced or dismissed any longer. Claudia nodded stiffly and quickly moved on, avoiding Zara's gaze, but Zara's resolve only grew stronger. The flight attendant's attempt at placating her, at smoothing things over, was a shallow gesture, a weak attempt to right a wrong that had already been done. Zara's thoughts shifted briefly to her father, Victor Bennett. She imagined his calm, unwavering confidence, his ability to handle any situation with grace and dignity. If there was one thing he had taught her, it was to stand firm in her beliefs, even when the world seemed determined to push back. She was his daughter. She had inherited that strength. And now it was time to put it into action. As the plane touched down, Zara could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The flight, once filled with tension and unease, now seemed to take on a sense of finality. The wheels hit the runway, and the plane's descent seemed to mirror the final moments of the conflict that had unfolded in the air. The murmurs of passengers quieted, and Zara's thoughts drifted back to the moment when she would finally walk off the plane. She had made it through, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't over, that there were consequences yet to come for Claudia's actions. Victor Bennett, Zara's father, was a powerful man. The thought of him filled her with a sense of security. He was the owner of the airline, but more importantly, he was a man of integrity. He had always taught Zara to stand up for what was right, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. Zara knew that her father would handle things in a way that would ensure justice. If only Claudia knew who she was dealing with. The captain's voice broke through the silence once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to land at our destination. Please ensure that your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed." The announcement was routine, but for Zara, it felt different today. She wasn't just about to step off a plane. She was about to face the consequences of an experience that had tested her, that had changed her. The journey was far from over. She had been humiliated, but she had also been empowered. She had followed the rules, or so she thought, but she hadn't counted on Zara's strength, nor had she anticipated the man standing before her. Victor's voice, calm but firm, broke the silence. "Miss Harper," he said, his tone unmistakably authoritative. Claudia flinched slightly at the sound of her name, but she didn't respond immediately. Victor stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I understand there was an issue with my daughter's seat," he continued, his words measured and precise. "I think it's time we address this." Claudia opened her mouth, her words fumbling as she tried to find an excuse, a way out of the corner she had painted herself into. I didn't know she was your daughter, sir," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was just a misunderstanding. I thought there had been a mistake." Her usual sharpness was gone, replaced by a mixture of fear and desperation. Victor didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he allowed the silence to settle in the cabin, letting his words hang in the air. "The issue," he said slowly, "is not whether you knew she was my daughter. The issue is how you treated her. Your behavior today does not reflect the values this airline is built on." His gaze was steady, unyielding. He wasn't angry, not in the way one might expect. His calm demeanor only made his words more powerful. Around them, the passengers who had been watching the exchange were quiet. Some of them nodded in agreement, others exchanged looks of disbelief. But all of them were listening. They were witnessing the moment of reckoning, the moment when someone would be held accountable for their actions. Claudia's face turned red, and she swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the service cart. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain herself, but Victor didn't give her the chance. "Your actions today," he continued, his voice cutting through the tension, "were unprofessional and unacceptable. This airline was built on the principles of respect, dignity, and fairness for all passengers, and what you did today goes against everything we stand for." Claudia's mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of Victor's words was too much, too real. The reality of what she had done was sinking in, and there was no escaping it. The passengers, the crew, the man who owned the very airline she worked for, no one was going to let her get away with it. Victor's presence in the cabin was undeniable, and the tension only grew thicker with every word he spoke. Claudia stood there, frozen, her body rigid as if the weight of his words had physically immobilized her. Her face had drained of color, and her eyes flickered around the cabin, catching the glances of the passengers who were now watching intently. There was no escaping the moment. Her confidence from earlier, the smugness she had worn like armor, had evaporated entirely. In its place was a mixture of shame and regret, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage she had already caused. Victor didn't wait for Claudia to stumble over her words any longer. His gaze moved past her, addressing the entire cabin with a calm but stern authority. "What happened here today goes beyond a simple misunderstanding," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of his words. "It's about the values that each one of us should carry, both as employees and as human beings. Everyone, regardless of their background or appearance, deserves to be treated with respect. What my daughter experienced today was nothing short of prejudice, and I will not allow that to happen under my watch." Claudia opened her mouth to speak again, but Victor raised a hand to stop her. There was no room for excuses now, no space for the justification she had clung to. She had made her mistake, and now she would have to face the consequences. The passengers, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, now began to exchange looks of agreement. Some nodded in silent acknowledgement, others quietly murmured their approval of Victor's words. There was a sense of collective relief. Finally, someone was standing up for what was right. Finally, someone was calling out the injustice that had taken place. Claudia's cheeks flushed with humiliation as she realized that her actions were no longer just her own. They were being publicly scrutinized by everyone around her. She had been so certain of her position, so convinced that she could push Zara aside without consequences. But now, as the weight of her actions settled over her, it became clear that the consequences were inevitable. Victor's eyes remained fixed on her, unwavering. "Effective immediately," he said, his tone firm and unyielding. "Miss Harper, you are to be removed from duty. Your behavior today does not align with the standards of this airline, and we cannot allow that to continue." Claudia's breath caught in her throat, and her eyes widened in disbelief. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of the service cart, her fingers unable to steady themselves. The room seemed to close in on her, the realization that her actions had consequences suffocating her. She wasn't going to be able to talk her way out of this, not this time. The silence in the cabin was deafening as Claudia stood there, processing Victor's words. It wasn't just the passengers who had been watching. The entire crew was now observing her with silent judgment. The weight of her actions, which had seemed so trivial at first, was now crashing down on her in full force. She had thought that by asserting her authority over Zara, she was simply maintaining order. But now she realized how wrong she had been. The moment she had dismissed Zara, a young woman with every right to be in first class, she had crossed a a line she could never uncross. One of the senior executives who had accompanied Victor stepped forward, his expression stern. "Miss Harper, please come with me," he said, in a low, authoritative voice. Claudia hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering toward Zara, but there was no remorse in Zara's gaze, no hint of forgiveness. She had endured enough. The executive gestured again, and this time Claudia complied. With her head hanging low and her hands still trembling, she followed him toward the door. As she passed by, Zara's eyes met hers for just a moment, and in that brief exchange there was a quiet understanding, a recognition that justice had been served, even if the road to get there had been painful. The whispers in the cabin were already starting. Passengers who had been watching the exchange were now murmuring among themselves, sharing their thoughts on what had just transpired. Some seemed satisfied, nodding in agreement with Victor's decision, while others appeared uncertain, still processing the gravity of the situation. But all of them had witnessed something important, a moment when power was used for the right reasons, when a wrong was righted, and when dignity was restored. Zara sat back down in her seat, her mind a mixture of emotions. She had been humiliated, treated like an outsider, but now she felt a quiet sense of relief. It wasn't over, not entirely, but it was a step in the right direction. She had stood her ground, and her father had stood by her, ensuring that the values of respect and fairness would prevail. As the cabin settled into a strange calm, the last of the passengers exited the plane. The crew, now visibly unsettled by what had just occurred, began to prepare for the final stages of disembarkation. But for Zara, the most important moment was yet to come. She was about to face her father once again, the man who had always taught her the importance of respect, integrity, and fairness. When Victor reached her seat, he didn't need to say anything more. His presence alone was enough to assure her that everything would be okay. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Zara allowed herself to relax. She was okay, and for the first time in a long while, she knew that everything she had been taught was true. Justice would prevail. As Zara stood to leave the plane, she took one last glance at the space that had been the stage for her confrontation with Claudia. The sleek walls of the first-class cabin, the plush leather seats, and the subtle hum of the aircraft felt different now. The usual comfort and luxury of first class now felt hollow to her, a reminder of the prejudice and assumptions that people like Claudia had carried with them. Zara couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened wasn't just about her. It was a reflection of a much larger issue, one that went beyond the airplane and touched every part of society. She walked down the aisle toward the door, her father by her side. He had remained quiet during the final moments, letting his actions speak for him. But now, as they stood together in the exit area, Victor spoke softly. "I'm proud of you, Zara," he said, his voice warm but full of weight. "You handled yourself with grace just like I taught you. You never let them take your dignity." Zara smiled up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I didn't have a choice, Dad," she said quietly. "You've always shown me how to handle things the right way. And I couldn't back down. I couldn't let them think they could get away with treating me like that." Victor nodded, his expression softening. "I know. And I'll make sure this never happens again, not just to you, but to anyone else. No one deserves to feel that way, Zara." He placed a gentle hand on her back as they stepped off the plane, the sound of the crew's busy movements in the background. Zara could hear the whispers as they walked past the remaining passengers. Some were admiring, some curious, others perhaps uncomfortable. But she didn't care. This wasn't about what anyone thought of her. It was about what was right, and she had done what was right. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had shown others that they didn't have to accept being mistreated, no matter who they were or where they came from. As they exited the plane and made their way toward the terminal, Zara felt a mix of exhaustion and empowerment. The fight wasn't over, but she had taken the first step. And that first step had made all the difference. Victor and Zara made their way through the terminal, their strides purposeful and synchronized. As they walked, Zara noticed the subtle change in the air. The quiet confidence her father exuded seemed to shift the energy around them. Passengers and airline staff alike seemed to recognize who he was, but it wasn't just his stature that commanded respect. It was the calm authority he carried with him, the kind that didn't need to be spoken, just understood. When they reached the exit, Zara paused for a moment, looking back toward the plane. She had expected to feel relief, to feel like the ordeal was over, but there was a nagging thought that wouldn't let go. What happens now? She knew this wasn't just about her. What about Claudia? What about the system that allowed her to behave this way in the first place? Victor turned toward her, sensing her thoughts. "I'll take care of everything, Zara. This isn't just about you. It's about making sure that no one else ever feels the way you did today." His voice was firm, but there was also a trace of sadness in it, sadness that it had to come to this. But Victor knew that this moment was bigger than the two of them. It was a chance to make things right. Zara looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know, Dad, but it's just hard to believe that people like Claudia still exist, you know? It's like we're supposed to just accept it." Victor sighed, his face softening. "I understand, sweetheart. It's hard. But you have to remember that change starts with people like us. We can't always control how others behave, but we can control how we respond. And we can make sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." Zara nodded, taking a deep breath as they continued walking through the terminal. She knew that Victor's words were true. Change might be slow and it might be difficult, but it was possible. And she was going to be part of that change. As they made their way to the car, Zara's mind began to shift. The anger and frustration that had built up inside her earlier were now replaced with a sense of quiet resolution. She had fought her battle, and though it wasn't over, she had won this round. But there was more to be done. More people needed to understand that they weren't alone, that standing up for what was right wasn't just about fighting. It was about making sure that the next generation didn't have to endure the same battles. Zara's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to check the message. It was from one of her friends, asking how her flight had gone. She smiled, knowing that she didn't have to hide the truth. She could be honest about what had happened, and more importantly, she could be proud of the way she had handled it. Before she could respond, her father placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping her for a moment. "You know, Zara," he said, his voice quiet but full of meaning, "what happened today is a reminder of the work we still have to do. We all have a responsibility to make sure people are treated with respect. It's not just about owning an airline, it's about owning up to our responsibilities, to our values, and to making sure that everyone has a fair chance. No one should ever feel less than, no matter who they are." Zara nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for her father's unwavering support. "I know, Dad, and I'll do my part too. I won't let it slide, not for myself and not for anyone else." Her resolve was clear, her voice steady with conviction. Victor smiled down at her. "That's my girl." As they walked toward the waiting car, Zara knew that the fight wasn't over, but she felt stronger than ever. With her father by her side, she was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't just a passenger on this journey. She was taking the wheel. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with unspoken understanding. Zara sat beside her father, her thoughts still racing. The ordeal on the plane had shaken her, but it had also made her realize something important. She wasn't alone. Her father's quiet strength, his unyielding support, had shown her that she had a place in this world where she was worthy of respect. But even more than that, he had reminded her that the fight for fairness and dignity wasn't just about the individual. It was about everyone, about changing the systems and attitudes that allowed prejudice to thrive, unchecked. As they neared their home, Zara looked out the window, her mind shifting from the past few hours to the future. She thought about the work that lay ahead, not just for herself, but for the world around her. She wanted to make a difference, to be part of the change that was so desperately needed. But she knew that change didn't happen overnight. It happened one conversation, one action at a time. Victor glanced at her as he pulled into the driveway, sensing her thoughts. "It's not easy," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "Change never is, but it's worth fighting for, and you've already started. Just by standing up for yourself, you've shown others that they don't have to accept being treated unfairly." Zara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She had always admired her father's wisdom, his ability to see things clearly and calmly, even when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. "I just don't want anyone else to feel like I did today," Zara replied softly. "I want to be part of making sure it never happens again." "You will be," Victor said, his voice full of certainty. "You're stronger than you think, Zara. You've got a lot more power than you realize." As they stepped out of the car and into the quiet of their home, Zara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had faced a challenge today, one that had tested her in ways she hadn't expected. But now she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't just a passenger in this fight for justice, she was taking the lead. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and discussions. Victor had already begun making calls to ensure that the incident was addressed, not just in terms of Claudia's behavior, but in a broader, systemic way. He had insisted on a full review of the airline's staff training programs, emphasizing the importance of diversity, inclusion, and respect in every aspect of the airline's operations. Zara wasn't involved directly in those meetings. Her father didn't want to burden her with the weight of corporate decisions just yet. But she knew that he was doing what needed to be done. He had already started making changes, and Zara had no doubt that the airline would emerge stronger and more aware because of it. The foundation of respect that her father had built the company on wasn't just a slogan, it was a way of life. In the meantime, Zara began her own quiet journey. She took to social media, sharing her experience, not for pity, but for awareness. She wanted people to know what had happened, not just to her, but to anyone who had faced similar discrimination. Her posts were calm but powerful, speaking not just about the incident, but about the importance of standing up for oneself and for others. The response was overwhelming. Comments flooded in from people who had experienced similar injustices, and many thanked Zara for speaking out. Some even shared their own stories, their own struggles with being treated as if they didn't belong, simply because of the way they looked. Zara felt a deep connection to these people, their words echoing in her mind as she read through each comment. It wasn't easy, sharing something so personal with the world. But Zara realized that this was her chance to make a difference, to be part of the movement for change. And slowly she began to understand the full weight of her father's words. Change never is easy, but it's worth fighting for. As they neared their home, Zara looked out the window, her mind shifting from the past few hours to the future. She thought about the work that lay ahead, not just for herself, but for the world around her. She wanted to make a difference, to be part of the change that was so desperately needed, but she knew that change didn't happen overnight. It happened one conversation, one action at a time. Victor glanced at her as he pulled into the driveway, sensing her thoughts. "It's not easy," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "Change never is. But it's worth fighting for, and you've already started. Just by standing up for yourself, you've shown others that they don't have to accept being treated unfairly." Zara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She had always admired her father's wisdom, his ability to see things clearly and calmly, even when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. "I just don't want anyone else to feel like I did today," Zara replied softly. "I want to be part of making sure it never happens again." "You will be," Victor said, his voice full of certainty. "You're stronger than you think, Zara. You've got a lot more power than you realize." As they stepped out of the car and into the quiet of their home, Zara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had faced a challenge today, one that had tested her in ways she hadn't expected. But now, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't just a passenger in this fight for justice, she was taking the lead. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and discussions. Victor had already begun making calls to ensure that the incident was addressed, not just in terms of Claudia's behavior, but in a broader, systemic way. He had insisted on a full review of the airline's staff training programs, emphasizing the importance of diversity, inclusion, and respect in every aspect of the airline's operations. Zara wasn't involved directly in those meetings. Her father didn't want to burden her with the weight of corporate decisions just yet. But she knew that he was doing what needed to be done. He had already started making changes, and Zara had no doubt that the airline would emerge stronger and more aware because of it. The foundation of respect that her father had built the company on wasn't just a slogan, it was a way of life. In the meantime, Zara began her own quiet journey. She took to social media, sharing her experience, not for pity, but for awareness. She wanted people to know what had happened, not just to her, but to anyone who had faced similar discrimination. Her posts were calm but powerful, speaking not just about the incident, but about the importance of standing up for oneself and for others. The response was overwhelming. Comments flooded in from people who had experienced similar injustices, and many thanked Zara for speaking out. Some even shared their own stories, their own struggles with being treated as if they didn't belong simply because of the way they looked. Zara felt a deep connection to these people, their words echoing in her mind as she read through each comment. It wasn't easy, sharing something so personal with the world. But Zara realized that this was her chance to make a difference, to be part of the movement for change. And slowly she began to understand the full weight of her father's words. Change never is easy, but it's worth fighting for. Weeks passed, and the story of what had happened on the plane continued to ripple outward. The airline had made significant changes to its training programs, implementing workshops on diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias for every employee. These changes weren't just about following rules, they were about changing attitudes, about creating an environment where respect wasn't just expected, but practiced every day. Zara had been invited to speak at a few events about her experience, sharing her story in front of audiences eager to learn and grow. She was no longer just the young woman who had been unfairly treated on a plane. She had become a voice for justice, a voice that spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt invisible or unheard. One day, as she sat in her room reading through the many messages of support she had received, her father came in and sat beside her. "You've done something amazing, Zara," he said, his voice full of pride. "You've taken something painful and turned it into something powerful. You've shown the world what it means to stand up for what's right." Zara smiled, looking up at him. "I didn't do it alone, Dad. I had you by my side the whole time." Victor chuckled softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We've always got each other's backs. But what you've done, Zara, that's all you. You've made a difference." Zara looked out the window, her thoughts filled with the future. The road ahead would still be challenging, but she was no longer afraid. She knew that, no matter what came her way, she had the strength to face it head on. She was no longer just a passenger in her own life. She was the one driving change. And as the sun began to set, Zara felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Change was happening. And it had started with one small act of standing up for herself.